Hi everyone, it's Miss Miller, and today what I'd like to do is talk to you about rhetorical devices found in literature, both fiction and nonfiction texts. But before we start, I want to make a distinction between persuasive strategies, pathos, ethos, and logos, and rhetorical devices, which is what we're going to talk about today. So let's look at our lesson in rhetoric. Now, the biggest piece or component of rhetoric is repetition. And you're going to see this concept throughout all of our discussion today on rhetoric, because there is repetition in some form or another. But we're going to distinguish between the different rhetorical strategies so that when you are reading a text, you can identify these strategies and discuss and determine the impact. But also, the idea is that you can implement these strategies, in addition to pathos, ethos, and logos, into your own writing to have a similar effect when you read a text. So repetition, as we know, is when you see something in a written response, let's say, for example, a speech that has been repeated over and over in the text, perhaps in the beginning of the text, the middle, and the end. And oftentimes, it's usually a word or a phrase. Like, for example, let's say you're reading a speech and the author or speaker uses the word freedom. And maybe in the first paragraph of his speech, his or her speech, he says the word explicitly freedom. And then perhaps you begin to notice a pattern that every other paragraph, this speaker refers to the word freedom by using it exactly in their speech. Now, a cousin of repetition is restatement. Now, restatement is where you say the same thing that's being repeated, but in a different way. This perhaps is the most difficult one, I believe, to find, because you really have to know what is the message that's being communicated in the text and how many different ways is that being communicated. I'm just going to express an example of what it might be if it were just one word. But usually a restatement is like a statement or a phrase that the author says one way, and later in the text, he says it in a different way. And it becomes more clearly stated throughout the text. You can look at it as other ways of saying it, like synonyms, like happy, content, jolly, and these are sentences. So maybe the author or the speaker speaks about being happy, and later he refers to the same idea of being happy, but he states it in a different way. Or he might use a metaphor to express it in another way. But whatever it is, the author restates the idea. Now, one of my favorites, and sometimes perhaps can be overused, so you have to be careful, is this idea of rhetorical questions versus Hypofia. Now, a rhetorical question is where the author, and you probably have heard of this before and have seen it, you've likely to seen it in a written word, is where the speaker, or if the author, or in some cases they are the same, not all cases, asks or poses a question to the audience, but they don't want an answer. And my favorite way to express this is a lot of times, like if I think back to like Judge Judy, I like to watch Judge Judy, and I remember she was really posing questions to one of the defendant or someone else. And she said, listen, when I ask you a question, assume I already know the answer. And that made me think of a rhetorical question. So when the speaker uses a rhetorical question, usually you will not be responding to it. It's a question, maybe you both agree with what the answer might be in your mind, but it's not really said out loud. Now, there's Hypofia, and that is where the speaker asks a question and then turns around and answers the question right after they ask it. This is rare, but this is often, you might see this as well. These two are tricky but interesting, and the only difference is one is at the beginning of the sentence and one is towards the end. So this is Anaphora. Again, the big R, because it repeats. There's a repetition involved, a repetition happening. Versus Epistrophe, and the E is like the end. So the Anaphora, you can think of A for Anaphora, like the first letter of the alphabet is the beginning, right? End. Now, the way it looks is, you may look at this one from Martin Luther King's speech. There's one phrase where it says, let freedom ring, and then the sentence continues. That beginning phrase between successive sentences or phrases within a certain paragraph or idea is being repeated, but that phrase is at the beginning. And then you might see "let freedom ring" again. And then in the third example, you might see the phrase again, "let freedom ring ... because there is more to the sentence. So it's just a continuation of the sentence. Now, epistrophe is just where the author does the same thing, but they put it at the end. So epistrophe, E for end, would be, they may say something in the beginning, and towards the end of the sentence it says, "I offend." And then another phrase goes, it starts with the beginning, however it starts, but now it remains the same at the end. "I offended." I think this was Julius Caesar's, from Julius Caesar's work by Shakespeare. And then another one, again, the epistrophe, the E for the end. The idea starts at the beginning, and then towards the end, "I offended" comes at the end. Now, perhaps the most interesting one is parallelism. And the art of parallelism, there is repetition, but not the way you think. These are exact and explicit. It refers to saying the same thing. This one, parallelism, reminds me a little bit of restatement because it's not exactly repetition. The repetition here is in the grammatical structure. The words and phrases aren't the same, but the grammatical structure within a sentence or successive sentences are. So if you look at parallelism, this is a great example from the speech of the Virginia Convention when it says, "We have petitioned, we have remonstrated, we have supplicated." And Patrick Henry goes on, right? And he's using the same grammatical structure. So this is our lesson on rhetoric. Again, repetition, repeating the exact word or phrases throughout the work, 3 to 5 times, beginning, middle, and end. Restatement is really when you say something, but you say it in a different way throughout the work. Then we have rhetorical questions where you ask a question, you don't expect an answer. Hypofia is where you ask a question and the speaker answers it right then and there. Then you have anaphora where the phrases are the same at the beginning, and epistrophe, the phrases are the same at the end. And then parallelism is just the same grammatical structure. This is just the foundation. The work, when you learn it, is when you actually do it, when you actually apply it, when you actually look to identify these pieces in your work, or if you look to try to replicate these ideas in your own response.